My name is Alina Hart, and I'm 82 years old. I've lived through wars, births, heartbreaks, and one secret that changed everything I believed about love. For 40 years, I slept beside my husband, Henry, a man everyone called steady, reliable, and kind. Every night, just before falling asleep, he would whisper numbers. 1, 2, 3, in a rhythm so calm, it could almost lull me into dreaming. When I asked him about it in those early years, he smiled, that soft, practiced smile that made me feel safe, and said, "Just a trick to quiet my mind, Ellie. Helps me fall asleep." And I believed him. For decades, I believed him. It wasn't until much later that I realized each number wasn't a lullaby. It was a confession. I was born in 1943, in a world where women were expected to build their lives around someone else's. Marriage, motherhood, and manners, that was our trinity. I wanted something bigger. But at 21, when I met Henry at a church social in Malibu, that dream turned into him. He was tall, clean-cut, with a calm voice and warm brown eyes that looked like they held no secrets. He worked at the local bank and wore crisp shirts that smelled faintly of cedar. My mother, a seamstress, adored him instantly. "He's a man who will take care of you," she said, and maybe that's what I wanted back then, someone to take care of me. We married 6 months later in 1965. My dress was simple, hand-sewn by my mother's tired but proud hands. I remember looking at Henry at the altar and thinking, this is safety. This is forever. Those first few years were the kind people write songs about. We bought a small white house near the sea. The roof leaked, the walls creaked, but it was ours. By 1967, we had our first child, Michael, and 2 years later, a daughter, Clara. On Sundays, we went to church, then had lunch at his mother's house, where everyone said how lucky I was. I cooked, cleaned, and cared for our children with the devotion expected of a wife in those days. Henry worked long hours, came home smelling faintly of ink and paper, and every night that counting returned. 1, 2, 3. At first, it was endearing, even comforting. The rhythm of his voice became part of our nights, a quiet pulse that said we're together, we're safe. But by the 5th year, something about it began to feel different. It was the late 60s, and small changes had started creeping into our perfect picture. He stayed later at work. He came home smelling of cologne I didn't recognize. Sometimes he'd say he had business dinners in the city. I'd smile, nod, and set his plate aside because that's what good wives did. And every night, when he came to bed, that same whispering began. 1, 2, 3. It wasn't soothing anymore. It was haunting. When I asked again why he did it, his tone was gentle, but his eyes were distant. Habit, my love, just a way to clear the day out of my head. But the way he said it, the pause before the word, habit, made me feel a tremor of something I couldn't name. In those days, women didn't ask too many questions. A peaceful home was considered more valuable than the truth. And so I silenced my doubts the way so many wives of my generation did. I told myself I was lucky. I told myself I was safe. Yet sometimes, when he rolled away from me in bed and I stared at the ceiling, listening to his soft counting, I wondered what he was clearing out of his mind so carefully. What thoughts did he need to wash away before sleep? I wanted to believe it was nothing. But I knew, deep down, that something had begun to fracture between us, something invisible but growing, like a crack beneath a coat of paint. It would be years before I found out what those numbers truly meant. And when I did, I wished I'd never asked the first sign didn't come crashing down like thunder. It arrived quietly, a shade of lipstick that wasn't mine. It was January 1972, a bitterly cold night in Malibu. Henry called to say he'd be staying out of town for a business audit. "Just one night, Ellie, don't wait up." His voice was steady, but there was a faint hesitation, the kind that doesn't live in words, but in the silence between them. After putting the children to bed, I sat by the window, wrapped in a shawl my mother had crocheted. Outside, the wind hummed against the thin glass panes. Inside, the house was so still I could hear the clock ticking on the mantelpiece. I don't know why, but I started counting. 1, 2, 3, 43. That's when the phone rang. My heart leapt. I thought it was Henry calling to say goodnight. But when I lifted the receiver, there was only soft static, and then a woman's laughter before the line went dead. I stood there, frozen, the hum of the dial tone filling my ears like a scream. That night I didn't sleep. The sound of the waves beyond our small house felt cruel, calm, and endless, while my thoughts twisted like weeds. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe a wrong number, maybe a prank. But deep down, something in me cracked. Over the next months, little oddities began to bloom like bruises. A whiff of unfamiliar perfume on his shirt. A receipt from a restaurant in a town he swore he hadn't visited. And that smile, the same smile that had once melted me, now felt rehearsed. I still remember the day I found the lipstick stain. I was folding his white dress shirts, a chore I'd done 1,000 times. But this one had a faint smear near the collar, a deep coral pink I'd never worn. For a moment, I just stared at it, my hands trembling. Then I laughed, a brittle, joyless laugh, and threw the shirt into the wash basin. The water turned cloudy, pink, swirling into white like shame dissolving into soap. I wanted to confront him. Every part of me did. But when I imagined his calm denial, the half-truths, the pitying glance, I couldn't bear it. So I swallowed my anger, hung the shirt to dry, and pretended nothing had happened. You see, back then, women were told that silence was strength, that keeping the peace was nobler than asking questions. And I foolishly believed that a peaceful home mattered more than my own certainty. Henry's late nights became routine. He said the bank was expanding, that clients needed his attention. Sometimes he'd come home at midnight smelling faintly of whiskey and cologne. Other times, he'd sleep in the guest room, claiming exhaustion. The children noticed. Michael, barely 8, began to ask why his father never came to his school games. Clara, my sweet girl, would fall asleep on the couch clutching her drawings, waiting for him to come home and see them. I'd carry her to bed, whispering lies I wished were true. "Daddy's busy working hard for us, darling." And every night, even when he was home, the counting returned. Softly, evenly. That voice beside me whispering numbers in the dark. At first, I tried to ignore it. Then I began to listen. Each count sounded like a door closing. 1 for the hours he didn't explain. 2 for the dinners gone cold. 3 for the lipstick I scrubbed away. By the time he reached 100, I would be silently crying, careful not to make a sound. Because if he heard me, he'd ask why, and I didn't know how to answer. In 1974, desperate for independence, I began taking in sewing work. Dresses, curtains, pillowcases, anything neighbors needed. My hands grew rough from thread and needles, but it gave me purpose. It was money I earned myself, and that small freedom became a secret rebellion. With every hem I stitched, I whispered to myself, "You are still here, Aliner. You are still something more than his shadow." Years passed this way, small wounds hidden under the fabric of our daily life. People still saw us as perfect, Mr. and Mrs. Hart, the respectable couple. But behind those smiling photographs, my world was quietly unraveling thread by thread. And then one rainy afternoon in May 1975, the truth finally rang, literally. The phone call began politely, almost gently. A woman's voice said, "Mrs. Hart, my name is Catherine. I think you deserve to know that your husband and I have been seeing each other." She hesitated, then added the words that would shatter the world I'd built. "And I'm not the only one." The receiver slipped from my hand and hit the floor. The dial tone hummed on, long after my breath had stopped. I don't remember hanging up the phone. I only remember the silence that followed, the kind of silence that doesn't belong in a home, the kind that hums in your bones. I stood there for what must have been hours, the receiver still swaying by its cord, the dress I'd been ironing forgotten on the board. When I finally sat down, my knees gave out beneath me, and I slid to the cold kitchen floor. I wasn't crying, not yet. My mind couldn't catch up to the words I'd just heard. "Your husband and I have been together for over 2 years. And I'm not the only one." The words echoed like gunfire in my head. I thought of every smile, every late night, every whispered 1, 2, 3. And suddenly, it all made sense. I don't know how long I sat there before the knock came. It was Mrs. Keller, my neighbor, a kind widow who lived 2 doors down. She stepped inside quietly, saw me on the floor, and didn't ask a single question. She just made tea, sat beside me, and held my hand. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm. "Ellie," she said, "whatever he's done, don't carry his shame." Those words broke the dam. I wept like a child, my sobs filling the kitchen until they turned into quiet gasps. Mrs. Keller didn't leave until she was sure I could stand again. By the time the clock struck 4, I forced myself to wash my face, comb my hair, and start dinner. The children would be home soon. They couldn't see their mother broken on the floor. That evening, everything looked the same: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, laughter at the table. Henry walked in at 7 sharp, kissed my forehead, and sat down as if the world hadn't split open beneath my feet that afternoon. He asked about Michael's school project. He complimented Clara's drawing. He smiled, polite and easy. I looked at him across the table and thought, "You are a stranger wearing my husband's face." Later that night, after the children were asleep, I waited for him in the living room. He came in with his newspaper, as always, humming softly. When he noticed I hadn't moved, his smile faltered. "Everything all right?" he asked. I looked straight at him. "Who is Catherine?" His hands froze. The newspaper rustled in his grip, then lowered slowly. For a long moment, he didn't speak. When he finally did, his tone was almost convincing. "I don't know any Catherine. Someone's trying to upset you." "Don't," I said quietly. "Don't lie anymore." He sighed, the sound heavy and rehearsed. "Ellie, people make things up. You can't believe every silly phone call." "She said you've been together for 2 years," I whispered, "and that there are others." He stood abruptly, packing, running a hand through his hair. "This is absurd," he snapped. "You're letting nonsense poison your mind." Then I said the one thing that made him stop cold. "She mentioned your nightly counting." He froze mid-step, his shoulders tensed, the color drained from his face. "What about it?" he asked, voice barely a whisper. "I think it's time you tell me what those numbers mean." For the first time in our marriage, Henry looked small. His eyes darted to the floor, his voice cracked. "I never meant to hurt you," he murmured. "It started as one mistake and then another. I don't even know why anymore." The truth came in fragments. A secretary from another branch, a client, someone's wife. Years of infidelity, confessed without tears, without passion, just quiet shame. And when he finished, I asked softly, "What about the counting, Henry?" He hesitated. "It's how I sleep," he said. "Each number was a reason, a way to make peace with myself after what I'd done, a lie for every sin." I stared at him, unable to speak. For a decade, I had slept beside a man who used numbers to bury his guilt. That night, I told him to leave. "Not tomorrow, not later now." He packed a small bag, didn't argue, and walked out the front door without looking back. The sound of his car fatting down the road was the first silence that didn't hurt. But the quiet that followed, that empty, echoing quiet, would be far worse. The morning after Henry walked out, the house felt like a stranger. It was too quiet, not peaceful quiet, but hollow, like sound had forgotten how to live there. I stood in the kitchen, the same one where I'd once cooked his favorite breakfast every Sunday, and realized I didn't even know how to make coffee for one. His empty chair at the table seemed to mock me. The children asked where their father had gone. "Business trip," I said, forcing a smile that hurt my cheeks. Michael squinted, suspicious, but said nothing. Clara just nodded, clutching her cereal spoon like it was a secret she didn't understand. That first night alone, I lay awake for hours, staring at the dark ceiling. My hands kept twitching, waiting for the sound that had once haunted me, that soft, steady whisper of counting. But it never came. The silence was unbearable. So I began to count. 1, 2, 3. Not to calm my mind, but to remind myself I was still here. A week passed. I managed to keep the house running, cooking, cleaning, sewing, but my body felt like a machine whose gears had started to rust. Then, one afternoon, the phone rang again. For a moment, I froze, the memory of that last call clawing back to life. But when I picked up, it was Catherine. It was her voice again, softer this time, hesitant. Mrs. Hart, I just wanted you to know, Henry came to see me. He said you asked him to leave. I said nothing. He told me he confessed everything, she continued. He also said he was going to make things right, that he's filing for separation. Her voice trembled. But last night, I saw him in a bar with another woman, one I've never seen before. Something inside me broke, but not in the same way as before. It wasn't heartbreak anymore, it was clarity. The man I had loved for 10 years was gone long before he walked out that door. Thank you, Catherine, I said quietly. You've done what I couldn't do, you ended the pretending. When I hung up, I realized I felt lighter. Not happy, not healed, but free of the illusion that love was supposed to mean blindness. In the days that followed, I began to rebuild quietly. I took on more sewing work. I taught myself to budget carefully, stretch every dollar. Each dress I finished felt like a small rebellion, a proof that I could stand on my own. When the nights grew heavy, I'd sit by the window, thread a needle, and think about the years I'd spent measuring my worth by someone else's attention. Now, my hands were building something entirely mine. A month later, Henry returned. He looked thinner, tired, his once perfectly groomed hair unkempt. He stood at the door holding his hat in both hands like a guilty child. Ellie, he said softly, please, I know I don't deserve it, but can we talk? I wanted to shut the door. Every part of me screamed to. But then I saw Michael's curious face peeking from the hallway and Clara running to the door crying, Daddy. So I let him in. He said all the right words. I've made terrible mistakes. I want to fix this. I'll be better. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw something that wasn't there before, not deceit, not charm, just exhaustion. It's too late for that, Henry, I said quietly. Trust doesn't heal because someone says sorry. It only heals when the person who broke it becomes someone new. He nodded, tears brimming, and whispered, Then let me stay, even if it's just for the children. I agreed, but not for him, for them. I gave him the small room at the back of the house, the one where we stored things we didn't want to throw away, but couldn't bear to look at. That's what our marriage became, something too broken to display, too familiar to discard. We lived like polite strangers, raising our children, smiling for photographs, pretending everything was fine. But every night, the silence between us said what words never could. The years after Henry came back were like living in a photograph, still, polished, and empty. To the world, we looked fine. The Harts, a respectable family in a modest home by the sea. But inside those walls, we were ghosts drifting through routines. We spoke only when necessary about groceries, bills, the children, never about the wound that bled silently between us. At night, he slept in the small back room, the one that smelled faintly of dust and forgotten things. The counting stopped. For a while, I thought I missed it. Then I realized it wasn't the sound I missed. It was the illusion that someone beside me was still capable of love. The years folded into each other. Michael went off to college, and Clara began working at a local school. The house grew quieter, slower, older, just like us. Then, one morning in 1998, I noticed Henry's hands trembling as he poured his coffee. His skin looked pale, and the whites of his eyes had turned yellow. Are you feeling all right? I asked. I'm fine, he said, smiling that same old practice smile. But even his lies had grown weak. Weeks passed and his condition worsened. He lost weight, moved slower, grew tired easily. Finally, I insisted on taking him to the doctor. The diagnosis fell like a stone: advanced liver cancer. How long? I asked quietly, while Henry waited outside the room. The doctor hesitated. Months, maybe a year, you should prepare. Prepare? As if you can ever prepare for the slow fatting of a life that once shared your bed, your house, your children, your youth. That evening, Henry sat on the porch, watching the sunset bleed across the sky. "I don't want treatment," he said flatly. "I've spent enough of my life pretending to live. I want to go on my own terms." I wanted to argue, to tell him he owed it to the children, to me, but when I looked at him, I saw peace. Maybe for the first time. So I simply said, "Then let's make the time you have left mean something." The weeks that followed were strange, gentle, almost peaceful. The man who once carried secrets like stones now spoke little, but carried a softness I hadn't seen in decades. He'd sit outside, watching birds land on the fence, sipping tea as if savoring every moment that pain hadn't stolen. One afternoon, while searching through his desk for some insurance papers, I found it, a black leather notebook hidden beneath old receipts and yellowed letters. My first instinct was to close it, but curiosity won. The first entry was dated 1972. The handwriting was unmistakably his. Tonight, I counted to 100 again. The guilt is heavy. Each number helps me forget, but I know I'm only burying myself deeper. I told myself it's the last time. It never is. My heart pounded as I turned the pages. Each one held a confession, not of names, but of emotions. Lies, remorse, half-hearted promises to stop. By the mid-1980s, the tone began to shift. The pages spoke less of guilt and more of regret, about wasted years, lost time, and the fear of dying unloved. The final entry, dated only 2 weeks earlier, read, "Today I counted again, not for forgiveness, but to remind myself of every reason I don't deserve it. Yet I still hope that when the end comes, she'll see the man I tried to be, not just the one I was." I closed the notebook and sat for a long time, feeling every year we'd lived together, every silence, every unspoken truth, pressing down on me. That night, I served him soup, sat beside him on the porch, and said quietly, "I found your journal." He didn't look surprised. "I always knew you would," he murmured. "Maybe that's why I kept it, so you'd know who I really was finally." For the first time, his eyes didn't look away. And for the first time, I didn't either. By October, the doctor's words had turned into reality. Henry's body was failing faster than any of us had expected. His skin turned the pale yellow of old parchment, and his once steady hands shook with every movement. I watched him shrink, not just in flesh, but in pride. The man who once commanded every room now needed help just to stand. Yet, oddly enough, the more fragile he became, the gentler he was. The anger that had once lived behind his quiet charm had disappeared. In its place was a tired kind of peace, like a man who had finally stopped fighting himself. Our children came often. Michael, now a father himself, tried to act strong, organizing appointments and medications. Clara visited daily, reading to him from the same books he'd once read to her as a little girl. I often found her wiping tears before leaving his bedside. And I sat beside him through the nights, when sleep came in fits and pain came like waves. It was during one of those nights that he called my name. "Ellie," he whispered, his voice rough but clear. "There's something I never told you about the counting." I turned off the lamp, sitting close enough to feel the warmth still clinging to his skin. "You already told me," I said gently. "You said it was guilt, a way to quiet your conscience." He shook his head, a faint, broken smile on his lips. "No, that's only part of it. It started long before the lies, before you, even." I stayed silent. He took a shallow breath. "My father," he began slowly. "You remember how I said he was a carpenter?" I nodded. I remembered him vaguely, a tall man with rough hands and a loud laugh that never quite reached his eyes. "When I was a boy," Henry continued, "he drank every night, and when he drank he became someone else, cruel, angry, dangerous. I used to hide under the bed while he shouted at my mother. Sometimes I'd count to distract myself, 1, 2, 3, all the way to 100. When I reached it, I told myself the worst was over." His voice cracked. "When he died, I swore I'd never be like him. never raise my voice, never hurt anyone I loved. But on our wedding day, when I saw you walking toward me, I felt something dark rise up inside, a kind of fear that I might ruin it all, that I might become him. That night, when you burned one of my shirts by mistake, I felt that same anger surge, and I started counting again, 1 to 100, until the rage passed. I stared at him, unable to speak. All those nights, the whispers, the steady rhythm, had been his way of keeping himself from breaking apart. Not guilt, not ritual, control. "That's why I counted," he said softly. "It was never meant to be a secret, it was survival." For the first time in decades, I saw Henry not as the man who betrayed me, but as the boy hiding under the bed, terrified of his father's shadow, terrified of becoming it. Tears slid down my cheeks, hot and heavy. "You could have told me," I whispered. "We could have faced it together." "I was ashamed," he said, voice trembling. "Ashamed that I needed something so small, so childish, to stay human." I took his hand in mine. It felt light as paper. "You were never small for fighting your demons," I said quietly. "You just fought them alone." He closed his eyes, and for the first time, a faint smile appeared, the kind that wasn't practiced or polite, just real. A few nights later, as dawn began to creep through the curtains, he whispered again. "Ellie, help me count." I understood immediately. I took his hand and began softly. "1." He echoed weakly. "2." We counted together, each number slower than the last, until his voice faded completely. I finished alone, whispering, 98, 99, 100. When I looked at him, he was still smiling, the faintest trace of peace on his face. He was gone. The morning after Henry passed, the house felt different. Not just quiet, emptied. The kind of silence that doesn't ache anymore, just lingers like a long sigh. I walked through each room in a daze. The air still carried the faint trace of his aftershave. His teacup sat half-finished on the porch rail. For a moment, I almost expected to hear him whispering again, those slow, familiar numbers drifting through the walls. But the counting was gone. And this time, it would never return. Still, something in me wondered. Had that final count truly been his last secret? In the days that followed, I focused on small things, watering the garden, folding his clothes, answering gentle calls from neighbors offering condolences. Each task was a way of keeping my hands busy so my heart wouldn't break open again. But grief has a strange way of pulling you toward what you least want to face. One afternoon, while cleaning his closet, I noticed a loose floorboard tucked beneath a pile of old shoe boxes. Inside, wrapped in a faded handkerchief, was a small yellowed envelope with my name written across it in Henry's familiar handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was another notebook, older than the one I'd found weeks earlier. The leather was cracked, and the pages smelled faintly of dust and time. The first entry was written in a younger, firmer hand. "Reasons not to be like my father," it began. There were 27 of them. The look of fear in my mother's eyes. The sound of breaking dishes. The nights I slept under the bed to hide. The promises he never kept. The list went on, each line a wound disguised as resolve. At the bottom of the final page, a new line had been added in faint, unsteady writing. And yet, I still became a man who hurt the one person who believed I never would. My eyes blurred. I turned the page and found a newer entry, written only a few months before his death. "I failed in many ways. I wasn't the man I wanted to be, but I never stopped trying to be better, even when I didn't deserve it. If you find this, Ellie, know that every number I counted, every single one, was not a lie, but a promise to do better tomorrow, even when I failed." The words blurred under my tears. For so long, I'd hated the sound of his counting. Now I realized those numbers weren't lies. They were his way of staying human. Each count a heartbeat, each pause an act of restraint, each 100 a quiet vow to try again. I closed the notebook and held it against my chest. For the first time since his confession, I didn't feel anger. I felt something softer, not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. Because maybe love isn't about perfect people. Maybe it's about the ones who are broken and still try, again and again, to be better than what the world made them. I looked around our quiet house, the same walls that had held our laughter, our silence, our storms, and whispered into the still air. I see you now, Henry, the real you. And for a moment, I could almost hear him again, that calm whisper from another lifetime. 1, 2, 3. Only this time, it wasn't haunting. It was peace. But peace doesn't mean the story ends. Because as I packed away his things, I found something else in the envelope, a photograph. It was of Henry as a boy, no older than 8, standing beside his father's workshop. Behind him, in shaky pencil, were 5 faint numbers scribbled along the photo's edge. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The beginning of everything. And suddenly, I realized, his counting hadn't started with guilt or anger. It had started with fear. That discovery changed everything I thought I knew about him, and about myself.